The money's on Talarico, but the polls say Crockett in one of the most closely watched primary races this election season. I am, of course, talking about the Democratic primary in Texas, pitting Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett against State Representative James Talarico. Joining me to discuss, Geoffrey Skelley, Chief Elections Analyst here at Decision Desk HQ. Very exciting, Geoffrey. We have been waiting for a polling average for the Democrats in the Texas Senate primary. Tell us what you have released and why you are urging a bit of caution when we look at this polling.
Sure. So yes, Decision Desk HQ, we just put out a primary poll average for the Democratic primary in Texas between Representative Jasmine Crockett and State Representative James Talarico. Obviously, it's been a high-profile contest. However, even though Crockett leads in that average, which we can bring up on screen, we don't have any new polling for even the month of February. Like there hasn't been a single poll that was conducted during the month of February, and that makes this a little uncertain, I would say, or at least more than a little uncertain. We know Crockett was leading more often than not in the polls that were conducted earlier in this contest, but we also know that some things have happened since then. Talarico has pretty vastly outspent Crockett between him and his allies on campaign advertising. And at the same time, there's also been some controversy over some things that Talarico may or may not have said about former Representative Colin Allred, who was originally in this race but dropped out just before the filing deadline in December. And Allred, who is black, this has raised some sort of raised the temperature even more on some of the, I guess, sort of racial and gender dynamics of this contest between a black woman and a white man in a Democratic primary, where you're going to have a relatively diverse electorate.
Sure. Also, the CBS Stephen Colbert interview with Talarico that wasn't aired and then aired on YouTube, and it's hard to know how all of that is being digested among the electorate, and the fact that we don't have any polling going back even before the Allred thing happened just seems to me that it leaves all kinds of questions about where this race is at. If you're inclined to look at prediction markets, which we haven't talked about that too much here, because you can always check on that, and the money is on Talarico. I checked this morning on the various prediction market apps. Talarico favored 66, 67%. What do you make of what we see in the limited polling? There was a University of Houston poll that a lot of people look back to, and some thought that was a bit shocking to see Crockett up by, I think, about 10 points in that poll. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then you see that, and then you see the prediction market. All the money seems to be pouring in on Talarico's side, and we have limited polling. What do you make of that dynamic?
Well, I think that the prediction markets probably reflect the fact that we don't have any fresh, recent polling data. So most of the things that people are going off of are other data points like fundraising, that advertising spending I was talking about. Talarico and his allies certainly lead on that front. So if you're sort of looking for traditional campaign metrics that might suggest an advantage or a potential path to overtaking Crockett in some of the polling that we have seen that's older now, I think you can see why people might be looking at Talarico as a potential favorite. At the same time, what I think we do know is that this race is certainly provoking a lot of interest among Democrats and maybe people who don't necessarily identify as Democrats, but Texas has an open primary system where there's no party registration, so anyone can vote in either party primary. So you have a very high turnout, notably high turnout in the early voting on the Democratic side, higher than the Republican side, which is very unusual in Texas. So that, I think that suggests a close, competitive, high stakes race where there's a ton of interest. And I think the fact that you don't have either side releasing internal polls also could be suggestive of the fact that they view it as a very close race and they don't want to necessarily give any fuel to their opponents. Or even use polling to make the case for fundraising. A lot of times a campaign or allies of a campaign will release a poll showing them up or closing the gap in order to sort of pick up fundraising, but neither side has really felt the need to do that publicly.
It also strikes me that you have kind of two rock stars within the Democratic Party going against each other in this race. A lot of times it seems like you'll have more of a maybe older candidate, establishment candidate being challenged by somebody with a huge social media following. In this case, you have two candidates that are both have huge social media followings and are seen as these rising stars within the party.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the most sort of the most star-studded primary that Texas Democrats have had in a long time. Even when you think about some of the candidates who've run, who've had notable races like Beto O'Rourke in 2018, only lost to Ted Cruz very narrowly in the 2018 midterms in the general election. There, O'Rourke didn't have much in the way of primary opposition, or at least not particularly high-profile primary opposition. Whereas this time around, you have two candidates who've both been touted for various reasons. Crockett has maintained sort of a firebrand approach. I think she's viewed as sort of combative and very strongly anti-Trump. Talarico also strongly anti-Trump, but has sort of positioned himself in the guise of a guy who is very religious. Is even, I think he's a pastor, or he's working towards his divinity degree, and is making the case that maybe his profile is one that could work better in a relatively religious state like Texas. And there might be truth to that. I think Crockett could also say that, well, look, I'm going to energize black voters in a way that Talarico is not going to. That actually could be a difference maker for her in the primary elections, since we know black voters are very strongly Democratic leaning, and Crockett will probably win them overwhelmingly. But the question sort of is, well, how do Latino voters break down? How do white voters break down? And I think it leaves a lot more questions than answers heading into the March 3rd primary.
It's an interesting dynamic. It makes you wonder if there's going to be any hurt feelings after the primary going into the general election, where if you're a Democrat, you're going to need everybody on one side if you want to have a chance to pull off the upset in Texas. What do we expect between now and Election Day on Tuesday? Is there a chance that we get more polling that would give us a better idea of where this race is at?
I don't know of any polling specifically, but I would say that it would be surprising to me if another pollster, perhaps an outside group, or either an outside group or an organization with no affiliation, like a university or what have you, came in and polled this race. At the same time, if it's a close contest, they may be reticent to do that. You don't want to look like you were wrong. But I have kind of been expecting a couple polls here toward the end. But maybe it's with an eye on later in the week here, or even into the weekend ahead of the primary. So for the sake of our primary average and our discussion here, we just don't have that data quite yet.
Is Texas a difficult state to poll, considering how big it is? There's all these different media markets. You have the plains, and then you have the border, and you have these big cities, small towns. Does that make it more difficult than maybe another state like South Carolina that people poll frequently?
It's an interesting question. I'm of the thought that on the one hand, you probably don't have a lot of difficulty getting a sample in Texas, very populous state, but there are challenges in terms of trying to make sure that however you're trying to balance your sample when you're weighting it and taking into account some of those regional variations. There's obviously, it's a very diverse, Texas is one of the most diverse states racially and ethnically in the country. So that's a consideration that you have to take into account when you're trying to weight a sample. And so you're hoping that your sample is the initial sample you get as a pollster is at least somewhat reflective before you go about weighting. Because if you start out with a really bad sample, or one that's missing quite a lot in terms of the demographic makeup of a state, or whatever race you're polling, that makes it tougher. You can't weight your way out of that necessarily. So I don't know if it's necessarily tougher. I think every state has got its own challenges. Like North Dakota is hard because it's tough to find a big enough sample. You have to, it's kind of the other side.
Everybody in the state.
Yeah, exactly. So every state's has its challenges.
Gotcha. All right, let's talk about the Republicans. Also a dearth of polling on that side, but your latest average has Attorney General Ken Paxton with a 4 percentage point lead over John Cornyn, the incumbent sitting senator. Congressman Hunt is at 19% in your average. What is your take about where we're at in this race? And I just want to lay out that it's pretty astonishing that we have a sitting senator here trailing in his party's own primary.
Right. So actually, in between publishing the polling memo that I put out on Tuesday of this week, There has been another poll that came out from a pro Cornyn outside group that found basically Cornyn and Paxton tied at I think 36%. But that doesn't really change the broad strokes here, which is that our average has Paxton very narrowly ahead of Cornyn and Hunt back in third place, but maybe close enough that perhaps if he gets more of a surge than the polls are suggesting, that it's possible that he could make a runoff, but a runoff looks very likely. In Texas, like a lot of southern states, you have to have a majority of the vote to win the nomination. And if no candidate wins a majority, you have a primary runoff, which would take place in late May. And this race has looked headed for that, especially when President Trump did not enter the race by endorsing anyone specifically. And of course, at this point, it looks like he's probably not going to do that, although there is still a little time left, I guess, for that to happen. But it seems unlikely at this point that he would sort of enter the fray. And so the thing with primary polling, and I think you have to think about, look, we know there's polling error, but there's a lot more polling error in a primary than in a general election. In a general election, most voters tend to stick with the party that they identify with or lean toward. So you're not talking about sort of as much of a part of the electorate that can move around. In a primary electorate, though, it's possible that a voter might like more than one candidate, and so they could switch between candidates at the last minute or whatever considerations they're making when they get to the voting booth. You see this a lot in presidential primaries, makes it difficult to poll those, and you have to sort of be open to the idea that there could be a more substantial miss in terms of where the polling averages are in a primary than in a general. People talk about polling error and polling misses in a general election, but primary elections are you sometimes see much larger ones, far larger. So that's why I don't think you could run particularly write off Hunt in terms of making a runoff in this race. But it certainly seems most likely it's going to be Paxton versus Cornyn in a runoff.
Yeah, I think the only real question, it seems, is that who makes the runoff. And I know that you had some polling averages. We can see there in that line when the Hunt line got closer to the Cornyn line, there was this nightmare scenario that we imagined for the Cornyn camp that Cornyn wouldn't even make the runoff. If you are in the Cornyn camp right now, how comfortable do you feel heading into Tuesday that you're going to at least survive this round?
I mean, I don't think the Cornyn campaign has felt comfortable once in this entire election cycle. But I do think that they probably feel reasonably confident that they're going to get into a runoff. The challenge for Senator Cornyn and his campaign is that they have trailed Ken Paxton, the most likely runoff opponent, in head-to-head polling, either before Hunt got into the race last October and even since then. And so that, I think, makes it one of those things where, okay, Cornyn has had so much money spent on his behalf, either by his campaign or especially some outside groups that have supported him, and it hasn't necessarily it's moved things a little bit. I think particularly it took some support away from Paxton, but at the same time, it did not notably raise Cornyn's support, and that makes me suspicious that he's in a really tough spot, even if he does make it to a runoff, in terms of actually getting people to swing over to him in at the end of the day in the Republican nomination contest.
Do we have any idea of who Congressman Hunt is getting his support from? Are they more likely to be people that would switch over to Cornyn than Paxton if it does come down to those two?
I think actually that Hunt is getting a bit of a mix, and you've actually seen spending by both Cornyn and Paxton's sides attacking Hunt here, sort of the close in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, which is maybe telling that both of them are sort of trying to keep Hunt out of the runoff, knowing that a runoff is very likely here. And so to me, that maybe suggests, on the one hand, you have a group of potential Cornyn supporters who maybe view Hunt as potentially a better bet against Paxton in a runoff if Hunt were to advance. However, if they think Hunt might not advance, maybe they stick with Cornyn. At the same time, some folks who want an alternative to Cornyn, like are not looking to support John Cornyn, might be worried that Ken Paxton's a weaker general election candidate and might look at Hunt as somebody who can be both sort of a more MAGA-friendly candidate than they think Cornyn is, but maybe doesn't have the kind of baggage that Paxton does in terms of some of the personal and professional scandals that have mired his campaign and have made a lot of Republicans in Washington worried about him making this a more competitive general election if he does end up being the Republican nominee.
All right. Well, I think we should leave it at that. But yeah, what an interesting primary on both sides there in the Lone Star State. And, can't wait to get with you again. Hopefully next week we'll have something to actually talk about here, as voters will have actually weighed in. So very interesting times over there in Texas. We'll leave it at that. Geoffrey Skelley, Chief Elections Analyst at Decision Desk HQ. Thanks so much for your insight.
Hey, thanks for having me.